Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Premiership Quarter. Today, I'm going to be doing my round 21 AFL tips and predictions for the 2024 season, going through every game, talking a little bit about where I think each team is at, where I think the game might be won and lost with certain injuries or positional matchups, and I'll also be going through how I went last week, which I'll get through right now. So I believe I got 4 or 5 out of 9, so not fantastic. Definitely could have got better. I tipped the Blues by 19. Port ended up upsetting them and winning by 14, where they were down by 5 goals and came back in the second half, only limiting Carlton to 1 goal. I tipped North in an upset to win by 10 points. The Cats were the much more experienced team and got the win by 40. I tipped the Suns to continue their home streak winning and beat the Lions, who didn't have a genuine key defender, and they ended up moving Hipwood back and got the win by 28 points. I originally tipped the Dons by 6, then changed it to St Kilda just before the game, as I felt that we could very much get the upset, and we did. I was not expecting to be a 53-point margin, however. I tipped the Giants to win by 4 goals, and they got that margin um, just after the fourth quarter started with a really good start. And then Melbourne battled back, which I didn't expect, but they ended up still winning by 2 points. I tipped the Dockers by 44, ended up winning by 35. Tipped the Pies by 32, ended up winning by 26. I tipped the Swans by 11, and the Dogs ended up winning by 39 in a fantastic result for them and really pushes their top 8 case for this season. And I tipped the Hawks by 14, and they ended up winning by a much more convincing 66 points. So I got, looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 technically. It's 5 out of 9. So not a bad week, but definitely could have been better had I not gone with a couple upsets. But with that out of the way, if you wouldn't mind liking the video to really help push my video in the YouTube algorithm, as well as subscribing to my channel if you like this type of content. But with that being said, let's get straight into the video.
It came up behind him like a librarian. Jesus!
So the first of 2 Friday night games we have between the Western Bulldogs and Melbourne, and it's a pretty interesting game. The Bulldogs are the more informed team for sure. They just came off beating the Swans at the SCG2, and Melbourne are coming off a frustrating loss against GWS where they started well, lost control of the game, started poorly in the fourth, but then really rallied back and just couldn't quite get over the line. It's obviously going to be a really good battle, especially between two midfields. Obviously, the two ruckmen, All Australian last year, possibly All Australian ruckman this year, English and Gawn. And then you've also got two really good midfields. The 2021 Grand Final replay. And it's going to be quite an interesting game. I think definitely based off of form, the Bulldogs would be the winners. But Melbourne, I still think, sort of play to the level of their opponents. They very rarely get blown out, aside from against Fremantle somehow. And I think they're actually a very tough team to play against. Obviously, I think Hogan monstered May and not Tomlinson, McDonald last week. And if Ugle Hagen, who's in some fantastic form, can do that again, that obviously gives the Bulldogs a big boost. But I think it'll be a bit more difficult because the Swans are dealing with a bit more injury struggles and form issues than what Melbourne are. I don't think it's going to be an easy game for the Bulldogs, but I think because it's at Marvel, it gives them a bit more of an advantage. And I'll have them winning by 8 points. I think the transformation of Lobb and Jones in this backline with Buku Kamas as that medium defender has really pushed this side forward. And I think that against a Melbourne forward line that continues to struggle, they'll still be able to play really well. And with Liam Jones returning against Sydney, he's now able to build off of that. And he was fantastic as well. So that's why I have the Bulldogs winning by 9. The other Friday night game is West Coast versus Gold Coast at Optus Stadium. West Coast coming off a derby loss to Fremantle where they were up by 2 goals at halftime, but unfortunately couldn't quite replicate that performance in the second half, and Fremantle overran them. West Coast, I believe, have 2 players suspended for this game from the brawl that occurred in the third quarter, I believe, and they might miss a couple players, but outside of that, I think they're relatively healthy, at least for West Coast's sake. Then Gold Coast are coming off a very frustrating loss against the Brisbane Lions in another Q clash. So two teams coming off the big rival games. The forward line from the Suns still hasn't functioned very well in the last few weeks. Obviously, Ben King has had his struggles in front of goals, but outside of that, he's not getting a lot of help. He hasn't found a partner so far this season. A lot of it has been Sam Day, but he unfortunately went down with an injury. Jed Walter and Ethan Reid are two younger players, and Levi Casbolt just isn't quite up to AFL standard anymore. They also traded Mabior, which looks to be potentially a bit of a regret now. So finding someone to partner along with him outside of Jack Lukosius, who's a bit more of a medium forward anyway, is the next step for Gold Coast. But it's away from home for Gold Coast, and that's obviously been a big problem with them so far this year. But I hope they get this win just for their sake. I think it's needed, and I think the talent on the inside of their midfield will really get to work against West Coast. I think Hardwick will really go at them this week. He did it a couple of weeks ago, obviously with the big media scandal, but I think it'll actually get through to them this week. And because it is West Coast and because of how much they've struggled this year, I do see the Suns getting this win, and it should be approximately a minimum of 4 goals for the Suns. Next up is the bottom of the table clash. How exciting! It's North Melbourne versus Richmond. North coming off a 40-point loss to the Cats, and Richmond coming off a 26-point loss to the Pies. Before this week, last week technically, I would have had North winning this comfortably based off of their form, but Richmond have honestly been pretty decent in the last couple of weeks. They didn't allow Collingwood, aside from probably the first quarter, to really play comfortably. It was a pretty even game after that, and they really put Adelaide for the first 3 quarters as well. But obviously, North Melbourne's midfield is a really tough thing for Richmond to be able to overcome. And I don't know if they'll be able to do it. It's at Marvel, so obviously Richmond don't necessarily play that well there. I think they're going to need big games from Bolton and Baker, two of their most important players, to get over the line. And Bolton just hasn't been quite as damaging in the last few weeks. He's really damaged my Supercoach, which I'm very annoyed about. He just hasn't found that impact, especially in front of goals. And that's going to be a key piece for Richmond to be able to get over the line potentially. But I just see North Melbourne being the more hungry team at the moment. And I think it's better for North Melbourne to win this game and better for Richmond to lose this game and genuinely get the number 1 overall pick because they need the talent. And so I'll go North Melbourne by about 15 points because I still think Richmond have been pretty solid over the last couple of weeks. Next up is Geelong versus Adelaide at Cardinia Park, and Geelong coming off a pretty solid win against North Melbourne. Nothing crazy. Tom Stewart was excellent. They weren't fantastic in the middle like I predicted, but elsewhere they were much better than North Melbourne. And then Adelaide got absolutely demolished by Hawthorn. They really missed a couple of their players that they lost against from the Essendon game, and players like Dawson, and I believe Walker was also not a laid out, sorry, he was in, but they went with 4 tours against Hawthorn and it just didn't work. I'd assume they won't go the same because Himmelberg, Walker, Fogarty, and Thilthorpe just don't work together if you're not going to play one of them in the back line. And so that's going to be something that Nix will need to change. It's probably going to be a Geelong win, and I can definitely see it being an Adelaide upset. But I think Geelong are favourites. I think they'll struggle to stop Cameron. I think they'll struggle to stop Stengel. And I just think that Geelong's midfield aren't going to be absolutely smacked by Adelaide. And it's also at home for Geelong, which is a big benefit for them, as we know. So I think they'll get the win by, honestly, could very easily get to 5 goals because I just don't think Adelaide have been anywhere near up to scratch this year. Next up is a very interesting game between Collingwood and Carlton at the MCG because it's obviously Pendle's 400th. Huge congratulations to him. It's a fantastic milestone, and it's awesome that it's against one of their biggest rivals in Carlton. There was obviously the fantastic game earlier in the year between these two clubs, with Collingwood getting the win thanks to a Nick Dacos winner. And if you look at the two teams based off of form, neither team are in fantastic form. Collingwood just beat Richmond, but before that they'd lost out of their last four. And then Carlton also, I believe, have lost four out of their last five. God damn it, English is difficult. They have at this moment in my predictions slipped to six. They're already down out of the top eight and potentially all the way down to eighth by the end of the round. It's a huge game outside of Pendle's 400th because it's Collingwood's season on the line and potentially Carlton's top four chances on the line. They got a couple players back on the weekend, Collingwood, which really helped them. Mason Cox was back, which structurally for them is huge. And look at Carlton with some of the injuries they're dealing with. It's definitely not ideal for them. Now, one of my Carlton mates always say that because Collingwood won earlier in the season, it'd mean Carlton wins now. But honestly, I think with the physicality Collingwood might bring, given it's the big occasion of Pendle's 400th, and the physicality Carlton have sort of lacked in the last few weeks and have struggled to deal with and have had injuries from, I think if Collingwood bring that energy and bring that physicality, Carlton really might struggle. And I could very easily see a Collingwood win, which I'm actually going to tip here. And it could spell a really difficult time for Carlton in the last 3 weeks, where I think they need to finish in the top four and to make a prelim final again. But it's going to be very difficult because I think Collingwood will rise to the occasion, and I think it'll be another classic where Collingwood win by 8 points. Port Adelaide versus Sydney is also a very interesting game, as Sydney are just above Brisbane and I believe it's Fremantle on the ladder at the moment, only 6 points, where they've lost three out of the last four, or four out of the last five, something like that. They're really down on form at the moment, and they've dealt with injuries. And it looks like with the lower rotation they used earlier in the season, it could potentially come back to bite them because the players they're too fresh. They're not experienced in the season. They don't have that form that they could potentially bring in. Compare that to Port Adelaide, they've had to rotate a lot of players. They've had to switch things around a little bit this season. And one of those moves was to put Asava Radaglia up forward against Carlton, and that worked. And so, up against Sydney this week, with Sydney's potential injury problems in the back half, where they have struggled with their tours, it could very well work again. And I think it's going to be a very tough game for Sydney once again to potentially not hold on to this top spot. It's at the Adelaide Oval, which is obviously a huge factor for Port Adelaide. And if their midfield gets the work done against this Sydney midfield, which has certainly been lacking in the past few weeks, they could very easily get the job done. Port Adelaide's entire game is based off of ball movement, getting the ball transitioning really quickly from their back half to their forward half, and then locking the ball in. They press up really high and really squeeze it. And if this Sydney team isn't 100% focused, they could score very easily, Port Adelaide, even with some of their forward half struggles so far this year. Now, if Sydney can sort of sustain that pressure and capitalize through good ball movement, which we've seen out of them so far this year, then they should definitely get this win. But they have struggled to find those kicks that they were getting in the first 12, 13 weeks. And opposition teams have sort of cut that out of their game. And players like Gould and Nick Blakey, Jake Lloyd haven't had the same impact that they once had. And so I think this game is a game of the round, quite clearly outside of obviously the big occasion of Pendle's 400th, as I was talking about. But I think that Port Adelaide honestly get this win. It's a bit of an upset, sure. A lot of people would tip Sydney to bounce back, but a lot of people would have tipped Sydney to bounce back at home against the Bulldogs as well. And so I think this game, if Port Adelaide midfield really get down and dirty and get going, I think they'll get this win. And I have them winning by about 14, 15 points, which honestly, if they get into the top four, that's huge for them. Next up is GWS versus Hawthorn. It's another very interesting game because on this ladder, they are 8th and 9th. And so Hawthorn are one of the form teams of the competition, just whacked Adelaide by 11 goals, and GWS just squeezed past Melbourne. It was a very, very weird game for the Giants as they were down early, really fought back, got a very good start to the fourth quarter, and then sort of allowed Melbourne back in it a little bit as a lot of teams do when it's late and you sort of make a push. Jesse Hogan was obviously one of their best players. He was fantastic. I think he kicked 4 goals against a very solid Melbourne backline. And so that's obviously a huge boost for GWS if they can get him in prime form. It's coming up against, there's also got Toby Green, who's been much better since the bye for the Giants. He's been a bit more involved in the game. And they've also had a couple of outside players like Peatling. He's been fantastic, had an awesome game against Melbourne. And Kieran Briggs, I think he's really stepped up his game in the last few weeks to help propel the Giants back into a top 8 position. Look at Hawthorn. I think, as I mentioned, the comparison between Meek and Briggs last week, I think it's there again. He's been fantastic this year in a very similar Briggs style where he's that big, bullish tap ruckman where he makes it really difficult for opposition rucks. And so whoever gets the lead in that battle, I think, really propels their team going forward because it's a two midfield going at it. You've got two teams who also like to use the handball and get their wave going. You've got the Giants Tsunami, and then you've got the Hawk Ball. And so I think because it's at Manuka Oval, that slightly favours the Giants. And I also think that with some of their talent in the forward line, although the Hawks have been fantastic defensively, I believe they're the number 2 rated team over the last 8 weeks. They are potentially going to struggle a little bit against an informed Hogan, an informed Green. And I think with the Giants setup, it could potentially spell troubles, but I actually think it's going to be a really close game, and the Giants just get over the line by 4 points. Next up is Essendon versus Fremantle. Also, by the way, that puts Giants into second, which is a big result for them. Next up is obviously Essendon versus Fremantle. Essendon, a really disappointing loss against St Kilda, where they got smacked by 53 points. There just wasn't that hunger and energy in the team after about halfway through the first quarter. The Saints were able to pile on 5 goals, and after that, they just didn't look like they were back in it after a little patch in the second quarter. Compare that to Fremantle, who struggled in the first half, were down against West Coast, and then really turned it on and were able to win quite comfortably by 6 goals in the end. Caleb Sarong and Andy Brayshaw continuing their fantastic seasons. They're really pushing this Fremantle midfield. They'll be missing that 5, I believe, although they are challenging the decision that he got after striking, I believe it was Jai Cully in the head. I don't think he'll get off because it was a pretty clear-cut case to me where he just pushed him straight in the face. But a big reason as to why Fremantle are in such a good position is because their forward line, which has been a bit of a problem in the last couple of years, really is getting going now. They've got Tracy in fantastic form. Miss has been fantastic. They've still got their Mosquito fleet, and Darcy and Jackson are just making enough, doing enough, you can say, in the forward line to be able to present as an option to allow them to succeed. They have obviously dealt with some injuries in the backline. Cox has missed a lot of the year, and they're now missing Pearce. But Luke Ryan has stood up and been really effective. And they've got a couple of others like Jordan Clark, who has had fantastic seasons. Now, while this is at the MCG and that certainly favours Essendon, they're just not in good form at all. I think with Essendon's midfield not being in good form outside of merit, Fremantle really should get the clearance dominance as they have all year. And I don't see this being any different because Darcy and Jackson will control the air. If you do that against Essendon, you really get the game on your terms. And with Essendon struggling last week against Just Marshall, I don't see why they wouldn't struggle against Darcy and Jackson. Hence why I've got the Bombers winning. The Dockers winning by 19 points. The last game of the round, I believe, is between St Kilda and Brisbane. St Kilda getting the job done over Essendon with a 9-goal win. Fantastic effort, fantastic result for them to sort of close the year. They are still a mathematical chance to make finals. However, it's very, very unlikely. They've got to win every game quite comfortably and got to get a couple of results their way. Brisbane, on the other hand, really pushed Gold Coast and were able to get the win by 5 goals in the end, which not a lot of people would have expected given the injuries they had in the back half. You missed out on Andrews, there was no Jack Payne, Darragh Joyce was also injured, and you had to move Eric Hipwood back there. And whilst Ben King was a bit ineffective in front of goal, you still got to give credits to Hipwood, who played pretty well on him, considering he barely has played as a fullback his entire career. And so Brisbane are just riding a huge wave of momentum right now. They've won 8 in a row, which is the clear-cut second best so far this season, just behind Sydney. And they're in some of the best form you'll see from a team so far this year. And if they get this win, they'll only be 2 points behind Sydney for top of the table. They have now in pole position to finish second and get a home prelim, which is obviously huge for them. The midfield is humming. Neil, Dunkley, Ashcroft now back in there. McInerney's been very good this season. I think it's going to be a tough game because that's how St Kilda like to play. They like to make it difficult for opposition teams, but Brisbane have been a bogey team for St Kilda over the last 3-4 years. And so I actually don't see St Kilda getting the upset like they did last week. And I don't think it'll be a big margin for Brisbane, but I think with some of their mid-sized players like Rayner, like potentially a Zach Bailey, the damage they can bring against St Kilda, who have struggled with that all year, I think will be enough. And I think they'll get the win by 15 points. Well, that's the last game. So that's going to be the end of round 21. So it's going to be very interesting. Collingwood rise to 10th with the win over Carlton, who fall all the way down to 8th. Sydney only have 2 points difference between them and Brisbane, as well as Fremantle, actually, who are pretty close to Brisbane. Only difference is percentage. Geelong sitting just outside the 8 on percentage. Port Adelaide as well, who really pushing for a top 4 as well. If they can get it, that'd be huge. Bulldogs sitting in this in 7th as well, and Hawthorn just on the outer with Collingwood tied. Just percentage difference with one game behind Carlton, and I believe they play each other this round as well. So that'd be a huge game. But that's going to be the end of this video. If you did enjoy it, please hit the like button and really help push this video in the YouTube algorithm. If you did like it, that is. Subscribe to my channel as well if you do like this type of content. That's going to be a lot more coming your way towards the end of the season. Leave your thoughts in the comments below as well about who you might think this week and how you went last week with your tips. But with that being said, that's the end of this video. I do hope you enjoyed watching, and I'll see you all next time.